right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ahmed Abu Hamad, a senior at Connecticut College. Thank you very much for joining us today for this session. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our guest speaker, Kasey Catlett, who is going to talk to us about how college students, faculty, and administration can create and work towards anti-racist efforts within the institution. This is a subject of urgent importance as we are all called in the current moment to actively move from non-racist thinking to anti-racist actions, moving from theory to practice. Our speaker, Kasey Catlett, serves as a director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. He serves on a number of working groups and committees at the college, including the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Implementation Team, the LGBTQIA+ Policy and Procedure Task Force, the Student Emergency Aid Committee, the Bias Response Team, the Accessible Technology Working Group, and the Mission and Identity Committee. Kasey previously worked professionally in multicultural affairs, LGBTQIA+ programs and resources, gender-based violence prevention and advocacy, sexual health education, and gender and equity initiatives. Kasey received his Master of Education from the University of Oklahoma. He was awarded the 2017 Award for Promising New Professional by the Consortium of Higher Education LGBT Resource Professionals and the 2017 Voices of Courage Award by the University of Oklahoma Women's and Gender Studies Program. As you see, I can go on and on about his great work and achievements. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our wonderful speaker, Kasey Catlett.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Ahmed. I appreciate the kind remarks, and thank you for having me. And I'm thrilled that so many of you are part of today's presentation. I will do a screen share in a moment, but I kind of want to give a little bit of background. So my colleague, Amit Tanjana, and I created this guidebook mostly because there was a call for people wanting to engage in this work in a variety of spectrums and levels of their anti-racism efforts, but some people felt really overwhelmed and kind of identifying what are the needs and how they can be a part of making sustainable change rather than kind of surface level or performative change. And so the guidebook was created in order to help people, regardless of where they are on their anti-racism efforts journey, to give an idea of where to move forward from that moment forward. And so that's kind of the idea behind the Anti-Racism Guidebook. In addition to the individual guidebook that will share with you here in a moment, if you haven't already looked at it, Amit and I are currently in the works of creating a departmental or organizational action plan. So looking at it from much more of a systemic issue into the greater institution or nonprofits, for-profit organizations as well. So I am going to do a screen share here and start. But at any point that people have questions, and in fact, I will actually ask questions throughout the workshop to keep you all as engaged as possible. But I'm going to share in the chat here so that everyone can look at it at the same time. Access to this is the website for the College of the Holy Cross that houses the Anti-Racism Action Plan Guidebook. On the website, you'll see the PDF downloadable document that anyone can engage in. We wanted to make sure that this is a free and accessible resource for everyone. The other piece of this is that if you decide that you are interested in using this for an organization or student organization or something of that nature, we encourage you to do so, but we do ask, there's a file on that website for people authorization, and it's not really us saying yes or no, it's more of just so that we can track where it's being utilized. And currently it's being used at over 50 different institutions across the country. All right, let me do a screen share here. So if you want to go ahead and download the document, or to open up the document, you can kind of go through it as as we go through this workshop. All right, screen share. Here we go. All right. So hopefully, if you decided to, obviously you decided to join in this workshop, the idea of this workshop is for obviously not for you to create your action plan in this very workshop, but what I want to do is open it up, kind of go through each area of the guidebook to get an idea, to give you an idea of what it is that it's looking for, and then to ask and to answer any questions that you might have about the guidebook. And very much to what Ahmed had said earlier, is that ideally this guidebook is to help move people from non-racist thinking into actual action, intangible action, and sustainable action. So in order to do that, kind of diving into kind of the specific needs and resources that will be used in order to fulfill some of your goals that you'll create within your action plan, Anti-Racism Action Plan. All right, so kind of starting it off, going into structure, there we go, purpose and structure. So ideally, again, much to what has already been said, is really at any point in your journey in anti-racism efforts. So this might be your first time even engaging in this work, or you could be a seasoned professional who's been doing this work for a long period of time, whether personally and or professionally. So that's kind of the piece to that. The way that this is structured, and as you start to go through the guidebook, that there are 9 very specific sections, but they've all very much work together, and there's a flow to it, moving from much more the internal processing and reflection into the external collaborations and movements to start picking away at your goals, the anti-racism goals, in the different spheres of influence. And so you kind of get an idea of what the different sections are. So what do you know about race, your spheres of influence? What are your values, principles, codes of conduct, interpersonal versus structural racism, identifying and prioritizing issues? What does it mean to be an ally? And then we start moving into the writing the action plan, into implementing, as well as revising and re-implementing the plan. All right. All right, the beginning piece. So what do you know about race? If you start to look at the guidebook, this is going to be, again, much more internal self-reflection. What's important is to kind of recognize where we are in our conversations around race, our comfort level, whether it's with the issues or whether it's with vocabulary or engaging with like-identified or like-minded people in order to obviously do this work together in collaborative efforts. But in order to do that, there has to be foundational knowledge or understanding. And the reason for that is to really start to dive into, so that you can start to recognize your triggers around bias. And so if you're starting to do this work and bias starts to manifest itself in your work, then you are already starting out in a very difficult or challenging space. And so being able to target those pieces within the first section, so that in order for you to move on, you've kind of processed a lot of this work. And this will be ongoing. And in fact, for me, first section is probably one of the more important ones, because well-intended allies can be oftentimes the most problematic in creating equitable spaces and inclusive spaces. All right. So in the questions that you'll start to kind of cover, what are your first learnings on race? What are your most salient memories on race, racism, and anti-racism efforts? How do you understand your own racial and ethnic background? What are your understanding of race, racism, and anti-racism now? Understanding anti-Black racism in connection with movements such as Black Lives Matter. Intersectionality, so paying attention to key components, particularly in areas of higher education where socioeconomic barriers come into play. We're looking at gender and sexuality, a variety of other access to education, access to healthcare, access to housing, and food. So you're paying attention to those different pieces there. And then the other thing that, obviously, if you've engaged in this work before, you're probably familiar with the Harvard University Implicit Bias Association test. Also a good way to start that foundational work within anti-racism efforts. But I want to open it up. We've got a little bit of time, but if anyone is interested in sharing, when you think about your own experiences of, from foundational or from your formative years, what were some of your first learnings around race? And then if you can think of them, from where did you hear it? So we can think of areas such as K-12 education into higher ed, some family dynamics, messages that we received. Historically, we can look at historical components, contemporary components, social media, healthcare, all of those different components. What were some of your first learnings around racism and anti-racism efforts? I'll let people just jump in. Any brave soul?
Hey, Jim Sachs, Principal at Clark Lane in Waterford. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So I'm 57 and I'm one of 6 kids, and my parents parked us in front of the TV from like 1970 till about 1985. And now when I see some of those reruns, I'm horrified at the way everyone was represented. It's really awful, and it's like cringy awful. So I think that was a huge, when you're part of a big family and your parents are super busy and they throw you in front of TV, that TV is a huge socializer, and I just can't believe some of the stuff that was on, it's just shocking. So that would be a big place where me and my brothers and sisters got our messaging,
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a perfect example. When you look at the benefits of television, but also the consequences of representation is important. But if it's not done well, then it actually creates biases, particularly with young individuals. So that these are the first learnings of how are marginalized communities being represented in movies and in television. How are they not? And I can see in the chat that similar first learnings around racism in elementary school through books. And it's amazing to me the number of books that are out there now that are much more inclusive and much more aware.
I think also, just I want to add something, I'll go back on mute, is the evening news. So my dad and mom were big evening news watchers, my whole childhood. And the evening news was always Walter Cronkite or some other very well-dressed, suited up white gentleman. And I'm not saying that they all weren't individuals and had interesting styles of delivery, but it was one gender, one race represented my whole, since I was born till I was about 20, maybe 25.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And now we're starting to see more diversity and representation. But the fact that it's 2021 and it's still, we're talking about the firsts of types of things.
Right.
It's still there.
Well, thanks for letting me give my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Let's see here. I've got someone who has raised their hand. Go for it.
Hi, so I learned about race and through my experiences being, a mixed person, because I carry the white privilege because most of my family looks white and I'm half European on my dad's side, but on my mother's side, we are Egyptian. And so I learned about race through my own experiences going to a predominantly white institution and going to the mosque on Sunday, where I was taught what is acceptable behavior in both schools, and that differed, and what is acceptable behavior in public, and that differed. And I learned very quickly that speaking on the phone to my mother in Arabic is not an acceptable behavior at my school, but speaking to my mother on the phone in Arabic is acceptable at the mosque. You know what I mean? And because I carry that identity and Muslim identity in America, it's further entrenched of what behaviors are acceptable, because not only do I have to prove that I can like have the acceptable like European behaviors and that I was taught that, but I also have to prove how Egyptian I am because of the way that I look. And so it's a constant battle of having to prove myself in different like, I guess, environments, and then never having the time to like understand and reflect on myself as an individual and as a person with like a personality and like thoughts and beliefs of my own. So I was basically taught how to um, adopt certain behaviors to navigate through the world because like I navigate through different worlds and my other friends were not taught those same lessons. I'm taught how to navigate this world here in America and the world in, you know, Egypt. And so there's different ways of like navigating different countries. And so I'm constantly adapting to that and not really like just kind of going forth as an individual and as myself as Miriam. So that was one of the ways that I learned about race. And just from like watching how other people behaved as well, because maybe they grew up in a household where both parents are Arab and Muslim. And so they are not taught like the same things that I was taught because their parents are immigrants and they themselves didn't get that chance to learn the things that I had to from a young age. So the way that like other people behaved as like in contrast to how I behaved, I saw the differences in race there and the difference in ethnicity in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Those perfect points. One of the things that really stood out to me in your story is this, at a very young age, the sense of tug of war in the different areas that you're having to navigate, and where and when you can be your most authentic self without fear of being discriminated against or being told that this is not the way in that specific space, and where colorism very much plays an impact in our first learnings of race and anti-racism, specifically when it's targeted to oneself. Thank you very much for sharing. Anybody else? Thank you for posting in the chats. These are really great examples. One of the things that's important to kind of recognize if you're asking yourself or thinking, I don't remember having conversations around race and racism growing up. And what's important to recognize is that silence is a message on its own. And so, you know, asking yourself, why is it that you didn't have those conversations growing up? Kimberly.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Yeah, call me Kimberly. You can call me Kim. Only my mother calls me that. Hi.
Hi, Kim.
And I apologize. I'm at home. I'm convalescing. So if there's noise in the background, I apologize. I dislocated and broke my right ankle in 3 places a few weeks ago. So.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
So Jim, Jim and I work in the same school system. I'm a teacher at Waterford High School, and I teach a diverse voices class. Well, I agree with Jim, and some things that were on TV would perpetuate that stereotype, and some of them are very, very awful. There were shows that I watched and were intrigued with as a young child that actually had the opposite effect. Like I was very intrigued by people. So for an example, this is going to sound really silly, but there was a cartoon show right before the Osmonds cartoon show that was the Jackson 5 show. And because that introduced me to the Jackson 5 music, and being an inquisitive little thing, I started watching Soul Train at a very young age. And this is when I lived in an even whiter town than Waterford. I lived in Gales Ferry then. And I loved Don Cornelius, and I loved watching Soul Train because it was just like American Bandstand, which I also watched, ravenously. And all I noticed was that, the music was a little different. They didn't play the same songs necessarily. And there was some crossover like the Jackson 5, but they did dances, and it was really exciting. And I was like, these people really know how to dance. It's great.
Yeah, right. I would definitely agree with you that I should qualify that in that there was definitely some people trying to break through. But I will honestly say that in my house, no one talked about race. So the messenger was the messenger was almost always the TV, which is really sad to think about. We actually gave up the entire conversation to these people who were producing shows, God knows where. That's it. So like no one I knew talked about race, none of my friends, none of my friends' families. I mean, so I agree there was some really great breakthrough stuff. I used to watch that Jackson 5 show. It was really cool. But there was also almost no conversation about race. And what was incredible was it was on the news. And I don't recall my parents, after there was a story about race on the news, ever stopping and saying, hey, kids, what do you think about that? They just didn't. It was like not even something you did back then.
Right. Yeah. And again, my parents come from even whiter places than southeastern Connecticut. My mother is from Prince Edward Island, which back then didn't have the bridge to the mainland. So they were very much cut off by civilization. And my father grew up in central Maine, which again is, my father was raised Catholic, which there he was prejudiced against because they didn't like French Catholics in Bangor, which again, when you don't have, you know, you make an other out of whatever you can in society, which is what I've learned. So that you're right, there were no talks about, in my family at that age, about, you know, outlying groups, marginalized populations, which is a far cry from how my household was. And when I moved to Waterford in 4th grade, in my class, I had just in my grade at Waterford, I had 3 or 4, you know, Black kids in my class, and one that lived down the street from me. And that was the first time ever. And they were just, you know, I don't know, wonderful people. I still, you know, see them and talk to them.
And what's really bothersome, and Kim, I hope you feel better. What's really bothersome to me is my dad fought in World War II against a racist enemy, and he didn't talk about race his entire life with his family. And it's unbelievable if you really think about that whole generation went to war to fight anti-Semitism and all sorts of horrible things. And then they came back and they just kind of made money and lived a good life. And they never talked about race with their kids, which is unbelievable to think about it. Yeah. Kim, I hope you feel better.
The same with my parents, and my parents have come a long way. And for like, they were not very educated about that sort of thing. Took basically us living in a little bit more diverse place in Connecticut than where we had lived. And both my brother and I, you know, having classmates of color. And then again, just like you said, my parents had preconceived ideas because they lived so far away from anybody that looked different from them. So, you know, we didn't talk about it, but, you know, yeah. So that's
so you're hitting on really great points. In that, one, it would be, you know, recognizing that it's a quote that I kind of live by, is that smooth seas never made a skilled sailor. And so when you're in a space that is oftentimes not very diverse and your only experience with conversations around race is through television or the news or lack of conversations that coming up, then oftentimes what you do see is where the bias can be created. So I agree with the Jackson 5 cartoon, but at the same time, you know, how is it being represented? Is it for comedic purposes, entertainment purposes? Are we looking at the connections of like actual lived experiences, particularly at that time? All right, so you kind of recognize the importance of this first section, in that this foundational work for us to really kind of get into our work is recognizing our own experiences. And part of that too is that with this foundational section, this is supposed to be something that changes every time that you come back to it. You're supposed to continue to add. So all of them, this is the one that's probably the most continuous in the sense of action being created from this, or self-reflection and remembering those key points. All right, so moving on to the next section. So then getting into the spheres of influence, where is it that you have the most influence in your own world? So when this is the part that I think is important as you start to move into the action steps, is that recognize where is it that you have formal and informal sense of power and different dynamics. So here's a kind of a visual of what that might look like. So kind of self, like recognizing what is it that I can change about myself, whether it's through my actions, through language, through active bystander intervention, moving into connections with friends and family, school, social connections, employment connections, community, however you define community. A lot of people do this, whether it's through religious affiliation, it could be through military, it can be your knitting club, something of that nature, and then looking at the greater society. The reason why this particular area is important is because this is a place where people can get really overwhelmed of, I can see in the news, I can see in social media that there's so much going on, I don't know where to target or where to start. So start out small. And I can't really say this enough, particularly for those who have not engaged in this work very much, is if you start on the macro or something really monstrous, then you're going to burn out, one, quickly, and then two, you're going to get overwhelmed and you may like, okay, I don't have time to do this, or this is beyond my scope. So make it small, hone it into something. But the other thing that I want to be mindful of too, when we talk about our spheres of influence, so what does that mean to you, is also, I think family dynamics are really kind of contentious and challenging, particularly in our current times. But what I like to tell people is if you're hesitant to, let's say it's Thanksgiving dinner and Uncle Bob says something negative and you become hesitant to respond to Uncle Bob, and trust me, we all have an Uncle Bob, that keep in mind that the lack of response can sometimes be created because of trauma. And so being mindful that the boundaries that we set are particularly around the people that we're around, of not allowing people to kind of step on us or to continue to say toxic things around us. And so you're kind of having to figure out what that boundary looks like within family dynamics, particularly when they're challenged with when you love someone, but they hold very problematic perspectives. Right. Values, principles, and codes of conduct. So these are also important to recognize for a couple of reasons. One, as you look through this section of the guidebook, there's a list of different types of values and codes of conduct that however you live by. It's important to kind of really focus in on what are your kind of foundational values, so that you have an idea of exactly your approach to different things and how you're going to approach your goals that you have in your anti-racism plan. The other piece of this is also like asking yourself, why is it that you're doing this work? If you're doing it for the purposes of, because it's something that everyone else is doing and I feel like I'm being left out, or I want to make a name for myself, be mindful of that, because that right there can also be an area where problematic pieces can come up for you. So again, if you're looking for this for affirmation, you're probably not going to get the affirmation that you're going to need. And from this, and in addition to that, what's important in that sense of allyship is that you shouldn't be doing this work in order to get a thank you. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the answers to picking your goals and working towards your goals in your anti-racism action plan, if the purpose is to get some sort of thank you or recognition, be mindful that could come off as performative. And two, is an area around false generosity, is that it was something that it was yours to give in the first place when it really wasn't. It was the fact that that rights and being able to exist in spaces is something that has been taken away, particularly to those who identify as Black, but people of color in general. So being mindful of why is it that you're doing this work, and how your values can contribute and your principles can contribute to, in a positive way, your efforts and your responses to your goals. Right. And then into the next section, when you're looking at individual cultural and structural racism, also really important to consider whenever you're talking about your spheres of influence and areas where you're wanting to create impact, primarily because depending on the type of goal or the type of racism that you're wanting to tackle will determine the types of resources that will be well suited and best to help you in that endeavor, but also who you need to bring in collaboratively. So if you're talking about individual racism, individual racism, you're talking about the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism in conscious and unconscious ways. So the first step in order to do that from that interpersonal or individual side of it is that self-reflection of where is it that you are, where is it that you've been, and where are you now, and your allyship, but also in your understanding of race and anti-racism efforts. Again, if there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be gained, then that will also impact your ability to do the anti-racism work in your action plan. And then moving into the cultural racism, so refers to representations, messages, and stories conveying the idea that behaviors and values associated with white people or whiteness are automatically better or more normal than those associated with racially defined groups. So keeping this in mind, particularly in areas of education, if this is going to be that sphere of influence for you, is through programming efforts, through conversations with colleagues and students, and any other connections that you have, being mindful of the connotations and the understanding that you have around cultural racism, because that will very much play into your engaging with marginalized groups of people. Right. And then next, from a kind of more macro perspective, institutional or structural racism refers specifically to the ways in which policies and practices of organizations or departments or parts of systems, schools, courts, however you define that for yourself in your work, create different outcomes for different racial groups. When we're looking at the different types of racism, how they're all interconnected, and that and also going back to what I was saying earlier, the importance of the self-reflection is that if we are in an area or we have a specific privilege or power in our workplace, and we're there making decisions, or our perspectives are part of decision-making processes, recognizing where our bias comes into play in creating these policies, because that could very well be the creation of an inclusive policy or a policy that actually is an obstacle towards marginalized folks. So be mindful of that. The other piece that I will say, and this is a bit on the pessimistic side of it, is that my belief is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to make something inclusive that wasn't built to be so in the first place. And higher education, or education in general, is a perfect example of that. When you think about for whom education was offered over the years or over centuries, the door, most recently, I would say in the last 100 or so years, has been kind of cracked open for more marginalized individuals. So allowing women into areas of higher education, allowing people of color into higher education. And so those foundations never really changed. The door's been kind of cracked open, and expecting people, marginalized folks in particular, to be able to fit into or assimilate to those structures. So keep in mind that a lot of the policies and procedures that need to be reformed really need to be reformed from kind of the ground up. So be mindful of that. Okay, and then the next one, so identifying and prioritizing issues. So let me first tell you what this is not saying. This is not saying that you're ranking the needs, particularly of people of color, and things to target or tackle with issues. That's not what that's saying. You're not ranking them. It's recognizing your own understanding of racism, and anti-racism efforts. It's recognizing your spheres of influence and where it is that you can actually start to target meaningful and creating meaningful and sustainable change. And the reason why I say that is that if I recognize that healthcare is problematic and continues to marginalize Black folks, but people of color in general. But what is important to recognize is that I am not a healthcare provider. It is not in my area of expertise and in my spheres of influence. So being able to kind of position the issues that you're wanting to target and your goals, and prioritizing them within your spheres of influence, and recognizing where it is that you can actually make them the most change. So in the guidebook, I kind of want to open it up for a little conversation here. There are examples of structural racism that are put into your guidebook. When you think of some of these kind of examples, or kind of the broad overarching examples, can you think of specific examples within your spheres of influence that you would be interested in targeting the most? So there are lots of examples here through education, employment, healthcare, housing, immigration, nationality. What are there things that you could add to this list? And if not, then what are some kind of target areas within education or within employment or healthcare or your areas of spheres of influence that you would be interested in tackling? Yeah, fee structures in higher education, really good example. Other thoughts? Yep, access to campus jobs, yep. Connection to socioeconomic, clubs and academic departments on campus, perfect. Anybody else? Okay, so this is a really good example of whenever you're starting to access technology, perfect. So when you're starting to look into these areas, particularly when we look at COVID and the impact COVID has had on marginalized communities, but not only in the healthcare system, but recognizing very much to everyone's points of access to technology, access to textbooks, access to the in-classroom experience, but from a virtual platform, of what that might look like when connected to access to Wi-Fi or a computer in the home, or what does the home life look like for the students, where most people have some people have at least one computer at their home, but if you're talking about multiple children in one home, that can cause some challenges and complications there. Excellent. All right, so moving into the next bit here. All right, again, everything is built off of the next or the previous, and will connect to the next section. So in our sense of allyship, recognizing where we are, and also recognizing that it is an ongoing journey, that no one is going to be a perfect ally, and there's always room for growth. So with this, looking at an individual who works with those keep that in mind, works with those from the oppressed group in collaboration and partnership, seeks to not only end the system of oppression, but to liberate. So again, it is not the goal is not necessarily to focus in on the Band-Aid work of how can we kind of mitigate the bleeding in these particular areas, but what is it that we can do from a structural standpoint to kind of shift the policy or procedure or whatever it is that your goal is, to make it equitable from the start, not something that has to be or Band-Aid fixers or performatives have to come into play. And so when we look at the types of allyship, particularly in the guidebook, there are 3 different stages. So ally for self-interest, this goes back to the values piece that I was talking about, of asking yourself, why is it that you're doing this work? And 2, if your perspective is of the space that I'm in, as I'm an ally because I have a Black best friend, or I'm dating someone who is Hispanic or something of that nature, then recognizing that there's a lot of room for growth in that, and that you're only recognizing this sense of anti-racism work through one particular lens. And so education is going to be really key, and in collaboration with others to start to build on those efforts, and much more of an awareness for self and for others, and that you're not looking at it from one particular lens. Ally for altruism. So this is, it's important, but I think my perspective of this is this often can be an area around kind of neoliberal perspectives of I want everyone to feel included. And we start to run into issues, particularly around colorblindness in these areas, and not recognizing particular areas that need to be addressed, where we start to whitewash issues, or we start to whitewash ways in which things can be tackled, or kind of the white savior complex. And it's important, and one thing that I will say in this, moving into the Ally for Social Justice, is that once we start to recognize areas that need to be reformed or looked at, it's important to note that oftentimes where you start to see areas, or where you start to recognize the fixes or areas to improve, is that there should not be one particular way of handling it. There's no cookie cutter way of addressing any of these issues. And the reason why I say that is because from that perspective, no one person is ever going to fit into all of these different ways of handling things. And so when you're looking at it from a broad perspective, or different outlets of being able to target or find ways to improve areas, is that you're going to have to take on more than one approach, so that there are lots of people who can kind of fall into the different approaches, and that way you cast a larger net. Any questions before I move on? Okay. And then we start moving into the tangible action pieces. So writing the action plan. If you look at the website that I provided to you earlier, one of the things to note on there too is that there is an actual, another link in that website of a bit of a spreadsheet, so that you can start using that as some sort of a tangible identifier of how to approach maybe what might work for you, but obviously it's open to however or what works best for you. So your action plan is created from the work done in all of these different sections. And what is important is to, when you start creating your goals and your action steps, is to make it realistic. So you're looking at your goal, the type of racism that you're targeting. So it could be, again, interpersonal, or individual. It can be structural. It can be cultural. It could be in combination of the examples as well. So it doesn't have to necessarily always fit into one category. But it's, again, mindful to recognize that, so you know a similar approach. And then the action plan, be careful, kind of have a little foresight into what are potential obstacles that can come into place. So challenges that you might assume that are going to come up for you, that can be from people, it can be from lack of resources, and bringing in other people in collaboration to help with that work. Partly the reason why I say that is so that you're not reinventing wheels. If there are other people, for example, on this virtual call who are wanting to do very similar work to what you're doing, it's ideal to connect with those people, so that you're not, there's not too many cooks in the kitchen. And so you're able to work collaboratively, combine resources, combine energy, and combine efforts to do this work. And so that you're also bringing in a variety of perspectives to it as well. So be mindful of the resources, create tangible and attainable timeline, so that, if your goal is to, for example, look at curriculum from an anti-racism lens, is that if you're expecting to do that in a week, that's probably not realistic. But if you want to spend a summer, or you want to spend a semester looking at curriculum from an anti-racism lens, that will open it up to work, making it much more tangible and not overwhelming you. All right. Here we go. So this is from an kind of a sample action plan from mine that I created over the summer. So this is kind of what it is that you might be looking at, or what this might look like for you. So the way that I approach this one, the goal: understanding racial inequality in education in Worcester Public School District's COVID-19 response. Obviously, this is going to be more of a structural racism and recognizing the components there. Action plan, so learn more about the issue by reading Boston Globe article and Worcester School Board response by July 25th. So clearly this happened over the summer. Attend the next virtual Worcester School Board meeting on August 5th and share my concerns. Write an op-ed for the Worcester Telegram by August 10th. So these are the things that creating, again, a timeline and a tangible action plan. Now, obstacles, so lack of publicly available information, personal attacks, let me tell you that was accurate, and then Telegram might not print my op-ed, also accurate as well. So these are some of the obstacles that you're going to potentially run into. And the last bit, so resources, join showing up for racial justice and organization in the Worcester area, connect with the neighbor who ran for the Worcester School Board, so that again, I'm doing this in collaboration, and it's not just in isolation. And then timeline, so I put the timeline into the action plan earlier, so you get an idea of what that might look like in a different way as well. And then accountability, identify partners in the work, come up with an accountability plan. So set deadlines to have someone review the op-ed that I wrote. So again, this individual action plan may seem like it's done in isolation or kind of on your own, but what's important is that once you've done that reflective work is to really start to bring in other people, so that it's not looking from either a white savior complex, or that you're not doing it from one particular lens, which removes the lived experiences of other folks, and that you're bringing in other people in collaboration, again, to build up collaboration, to accountability, and then also making sure that it's done in a healthy and productive way. Right. And then implementing the action plan. So the big piece on here is once you start implementing, again, connecting with other people, in that keeping in mind that your action plan will change and evolve based off of the obstacles that you run into, whether it's ones that you saw coming or ones that you didn't see coming, because then your resources will also shift. Also, the people that you bring into the conversation and you bring into the work will also change based off of kind of the timeline or how things are moving forward. So keep that in mind, that as you start to implement this, you may be adding additional work or additional efforts to your timeline or to your action plan. And then revise and re-implement the plan. Again, very much to what I was saying earlier, is that this is ongoing work. It's not meant, there's no finite end goal until liberation. And until then, I don't know that we'll see that in our lifetimes, but there's a lot of work that we can do in the meantime. But is that whenever you're starting to recognize all of the different sections that kind of work together, is that once you've done what you have created on your initial action plan, kind of go back through and see if there are things that come back up for you around the self-reflection pieces. Also, by the time that you've gone through some goals on your action plan, then your level of knowledge, your understanding of how to take on this work will grow and develop. And so then your goals will start to grow as well. They will start to evolve in a way that they will become more complicated, where again, other people are needed in those perspectives, but your spheres of influence will continue to grow based off of the work that you have done in your previous action plan. So it opens up for more opportunities to engage in this work. All right. and I'm going to open this up for questions here in a moment. So next steps, when you've started doing your action plan and you're going through your goals and you're connecting with other people and implementing change, some things to kind of pay attention to is finding an accountability partner. So one of the things that we do at the College of Holy Cross is I did a five-week or five-part series with our faculty and staff on the individual action plan. And so the 80 faculty members did it in several groups, but 80 faculty and staff members went through the series. And throughout the series, they started to identify collaborating individuals and connecting with people. And so that started to build the accountability network. Now that that initial series is finished, in the spring semester, we're offering more meetings for the people who've already gone through the training to kind of reconnect and check in and do an accountability piece around, where are you now? What are the obstacles that you're facing? How is it that we can all work together in order to mitigate those obstacles and to really be able to push people forward or empower folks to continue to do this work? So look for people to be able to provide feedback. If you're interested and you want me to look at an action plan, happy to do so. If you're wanting to get an idea of, am I on the right page? How can I start this initiative? I've got questions about something. Feel free to reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat feature, but then start to look at also where you can receive feedback from other folks. How can you improve on your action plan, but also be mindful of not asking particularly people of color to do invisible labor on your behalf. So again, it's good to kind of bring in other perspectives as well. All right, intentionality matters. So if this work becomes too much, again, my first thought would be to kind of bring it in, make it smaller if it becomes too much at the beginning. So hone it in, make it tangible so that it can something that can grow and develop from there. If it feels too much, then you've probably bitten off more than you can chew at that time. So, but there are still things that you can continue to take on. Be mindful of kind of the self-care aspect of this level of work. Is that burnout is a thing. So create kind of these timelines and areas where you can take breathers every once in a while. All right. So I went through that quickly because I really want to open it up to questions about engaging in this type of work moving forward for you individually. No questions, no answers. Okay, but I have another question for you. For you, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I'm wanting to engage in this conversation a little bit more, but for you, where are some areas that you have really thought about, this needs to change, but not necessarily know how to go about making that change? Yeah, Miriam.
Definitely, I've been thinking about just like at Khan's campus, the audiences for these kinds of programs and events. I came to Khan through the Genesis program, and international students came through the Odyssey program, and we had like different kinds of like intro courses through Unity House. And while it is like great to learn about other countries through the international students and get them more integrated onto campus, I wish there was a better way to bridge that community to the white community at Khan, because it is a PWI, and I know that a lot of work is being done in Unity House and in the like department for like equity and inclusion, but it's always like the work is being done by like people with these experiences, which is good, but it's kind of like figuring out how to make your own space on campus or figuring things out for yourself rather than like Khan as an institution and like the people with influence in the administration making a space for us and for people of color and for Black students, which is difficult because, you know, Khan is only like 4% Black, and there's an even like smaller percentage of students of color, meaning like Arab students, Latinx students, things like that. So I wish there was a way to bridge that community because, I mean, most of my friend group is white and we talk about race very frequently. Fortunately, like we all have had the experience of like talking about race, and I've been like introducing it more to friends and family, which has gone really well. And I've learned that they specifically, like white friends of mine, started caring more about race and started caring more about these topics because they got to know me and because they had that connection to begin with. They cared more about it because of the way that it affected me. And I wish there was another way to reach more white people and not just like you have to be friends with a Black person to start caring about the Black struggle. I wish it wasn't just like it has to be a personal thing. You know what I mean? And I don't really know how, like, as a person, I can get more white people to care about these kinds of things.
Absolutely. And so part of that comes, the empathy building type of pieces and what that actually looks like. And that's a challenge because oftentimes a lot of empathy related programs or activities that engage, particularly those who come from more privileged backgrounds are oftentimes challenging. In some ways they're problematic because, you're never, unless you identify within that identity, you will never know what it's like to be such and such person. So as a cisgender man, I will never know what it's like to be a woman or trans woman or gender non-binary. And so no matter how many times I put on heels, I will never know what it's like to be a woman. And so those are some examples of oftentimes performative activities. And so ideally with this this type of activity or this guidebook is that it does start to empower people to reflect on that sense of, what were my conversations around race and racism? What were some of them that were potentially problematic? Because ideally what that's going to create is recognizing that the reason why I have not engaged is because I have no idea how to, or I'm going to get uncomfortable in our society what if I say something wrong or I do something wrong? So it really encourages people kind of from the ground up to start developing their own level of awareness and knowledge instead of just jumping into the deep end and starting to do anti-racism efforts that then in turn either become non-sustainable or really problematic from the beginning.
Not only just like getting engagement, but also getting people to take ownership and responsibility over their own learning. Because like not everyone is going to be able to like go up to their friend and be like, okay, tell me what I need to do. Like, no, like there's literature out there, there's resources out there, there's podcasts out there, there's this guidebook. Like you can, like it doesn't have to be difficult. You can literally just like go on Google and look things up and like just start. Like you don't need anything. You don't need a prior like understanding. You don't need to have taken a class. You can just get started, because getting started and like making mistakes and improving is better than never doing anything.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree with you. No, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, so also one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the epistemic structures that people exist within, and how even people on each side of a spectrum for any political issue, they are motivated not necessarily by good motives. So even people who I agree with, they often sometimes even including myself, we sometimes fall into the trap of advocating for something not necessarily from an altruistic motive, but from because it matches my my interests, or because to signal my moral character, or things like that. So just the thing that I really want to change is the attitudes that people in each side of a spectrum have, that further essentializes the epistemic structures that prevent people from getting to understand each other's perspective.
Oh, most definitely. I agree with you 100%. You know, one of the things that we're starting to see a trend of are people creating these echo chambers, or areas where confirmation bias exists. So the idea that we surround ourselves with people who agree with our perspectives, we listen to and read information and facts that adhere to our own areas of perspectives or areas of interest. And so we have to be able to, and kind of even connecting the 2 points that have been made this far, is that even if you were to say, you know, you should just go out and Google something or kind of educate yourself, there's a lot of really problematic literature out there, really toxic literature out there. So we have to be able to differentiate between kind of that toxic news and toxic information and research, because there's even a lot of research done in academia that is as well as problematic. So being able to decipher what that is and connect it to our own kind of authentic understanding of race, racism, anti-racism efforts. Thank you. Any questions about the guidebook moving forward? I know we are running out of time, but I wanted, you know, to address any questions that you all might have.
I actually have like a question, but it's not really like specific to like the guidebook or like applicable to like other people necessarily. But I'm curious as to, since like starting to learn about these like topics and learning like anti-racism, what steps have you taken like in your personal life to like change things up? I'm curious as to what you've done.
Oh my gosh. Well, part of it is not only just personal areas of interest, but it's also my work as the Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So some of my particular areas of interest are around policy and procedure. So what I enjoy doing is looking at what are current structures at an institution, particularly the one that I'm working at right now, but I've done for other institutions where I've worked that are providing obstacles for marginalized folks. And an example of this is, not only are there structures that are providing obstacles for people and for communities, but also what are the Band-Aid type of resources that are available that are doing good work, but really doesn't get to the equity pieces of it. So for example, I'm on the Student Emergency Aid Committee, and it's great, and I enjoy doing that work and being able to help out students who are experiencing a particular hardship. But what I also pay attention to are the trends. So not only are they people from oftentimes lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but in a lot of ways, they also are people who are securing these resources are from more racialized groups. And so what's important for me to recognize is that we can no longer continue doing this Band-Aid work, is that we have to figure out how do we mitigate the problem from the beginning. And so some of the policies and procedures that we're looking at are being able to flip the script of how can we create equitable practices without the need for Band-Aids, so without the need for people needing student emergency aids. Now, I understand that in a lot of ways, if someone's house burns down or something of that nature, that's a totally different kind of experience. But what we're seeing a lot of trends on are particular areas where this institution should be covering from the get-go, and not something that students should be left out in the cold trying to deal with equity issues. But I also work with faculty on curriculum. I work, I've done a lot of anti-racism consulting work within academic departments, but also within for-profit and nonprofit organizations too. see questions in here. Oh, okay. Examples of academic research being problematic. So a good question, Alex. When I look at, so I'll give an example of this, and you could probably Google it, but we recently had a professor at the College of the Holy Cross write a really problematic statement that was based off of some false information that was done by a group of people who were particularly looking at data and then interpreting it for their own benefit, and not what was actually being stated. And so in that, he was using that data in his writing to not only send it to students as a PDF document, not encouraging a dialogue, but then also putting false information out there and claiming it as academic freedom. And so we start to run into those issues within particularly higher education where some of that information is not done correctly. Okay.
I think we have a question in the chat.
Yeah, I'm looking at that now. Oh, good question, Anne. Good question. So that's obviously going to be something that's going to be an ongoing challenge when you're talking about power dynamics, and when, you know, in particular, if your supervisor or colleagues are part of the problem. One of the things is to recognize what are the mechanisms that are already in place at your institution. If there are areas of bias that come up to play, you know, looking at your anti-discrimination policy, where do you have any kind of bias reporting system? What are the what are the areas that where you can actually start to submit some of this information if it continues to be problematic? The other thing that I will say is, particularly at the forefront, is I'm a huge believer of leading by example. And so a lot of people, well-intended people, don't necessarily know that what they're doing is an issue. And so if there are ways to create educational opportunities, whether through training or workshops, or if you want to encourage your department to go through the Anti-Racism Action Plan from an individual basis, you can do that collectively. There are lots of organizations that are doing that through departmental meetings once a month, and kind of doing the action plan step by step through each of the sections, and then coming together as a group to kind of discuss those different elements to it. So there are a variety of ways to kind of to engage in that. But again, I'm a firm believer in that kind of lead by example, and start out small. I know that ideally our goal is to, you know, have everyone become aware of you know, areas where they have opportunities for growth. But if you can start, you know, collaborating with people and starting to develop kind of that ripple effect, then the long term will be that people will start to engage in this work, ideally. So, but then also recognize that there are going to be people who you're never going to really be able to shift their perspective. So all you can do is continue doing the work that you're doing.
I have a question, Kasey. Yeah, my name is David. Thank you for this session. Really wonderful. And I feel I work in one of the departments at Khan, and to Miriam's point, I hope that there is more just on the ground communication and mixing it, as was brought up in one of the questions, so that we really do put the ideals into action. Mm-hmm. I do think the requirement of a different social power difference course that's new to Khan is a really great step. And I know Deb Eastman, who's worked so hard on that, is on the call, because I feel I came to the college almost 20 years ago thinking that no requirements are the greatest thing. And then the longer I'm here, I'm thinking requirements are the greatest thing. Is that sometimes we really have to bring, and I'm talking to myself right now, folks to opportunity and to education, to new knowledge. My question to you, if you have any tips on this, is that we've been working pretty hard in the dance departments where I teach on an action plan, an anti-racist action plan and curriculum. And I think we're making strides. But you know, you go forward, you go back. You know, the idea of perfection and not one answer. but I still get caught up in the fact of not putting extra pressure on BIPOC colleagues and students, and trying to almost start to make it in a little bit of a vacuum. And then I'm just, it's so hard to get away from that need of approval or okay. And I feel that the okay needs to work in some kind of conjunction with BIPOC students and faculty. And of course, we're super cooperative in the department and we're doing that. But I feel there's this little bit of divide. Like we really want to do it and not put extra pressure, and yet we don't know the answers really. So I don't know if you have any tips or if you've had to work through that.
The only thing I would say is, it really does focus in on that collaboration and that partnership. That and there is a balance that will need to be kind of figured out depending on the dynamic of your group. Is that you're not having people of color be your necessarily your approval. Because the other thing that being mindful of is that marginalized communities there are people in the marginalized communities that can just be as problematic to their own community as people outside of it. So so we have to be mindful of that. Not only are we creating them to be that model minority, or to be, again, we're looking at it from a early allyship, is that they are the spokesperson for all of how they identify. So again, you're bringing in a variety of perspectives and experiences. The other thing that I'll say within a group is that not creating a group that is, an echo chamber, that you're having, again, maybe conflicting ideologies or perspectives, as long as it's not toxic, because then you don't want to submit other people into a toxic environment. But it's okay to have challenges in a group and disagreements and different ways of looking at situations. But again, there's going to have to be a balance where there's not an expectation for faculty, staff, and students of color to be your verifier, but it is also important to have those lived experiences and perspectives at the table. So
thank you so much.
Balance. Absolutely.
Super helpful. Thanks for the session. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Let me put my email address in the chat. So if you ever have questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kasey, and thank you all for joining us today. And Clayton and I have both links on the chat for evaluations. If you have any feedback about this session, we'd love to hear it. So thank you so much, and again, thank you, Kasey, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kasey. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Ahmed.